Is unhappiness becoming a global trend? More people are apparently feeling anger, sadness, stress, and physical pain, according to management consulting company Gallup. CEO Jon Clifton also talked about this in his book, Blind Spot, The Global Rise of Unhappiness and How Leaders Missed It. We'll learn more from Jon himself, joining us now from Singapore. Jon, thank you so much for joining us on the Final Word. You know what? I'm a happy person. Happy with my job, happy with my family and friends. But your data shows unhappiness has been on the rise globally for a decade, long before the pandemic. Why is that?
Rico, I think there are three reasons that anger, stress, sadness, physical pain, and worry are on the rise. The first one is global hunger. Although the world has been winning the war against global hunger for 40 years, that changed in 2014. So there are a lot of people that think that the war in Ukraine created a global hunger crisis. That's wrong. It exacerbated an already existing hunger crisis. The second reason has to do with loneliness. Loneliness is a serious issue facing the world. And we find that there are over 300 million adults that don't have a single individual that they interact with over a 2-week period of time. And the last one is workplaces. The misery in workplaces is serious, and 60% of the world's workers have quietly quit, and another 20% of them have loudly quit. And the pain that they experience in the workplace oftentimes follows them home. Those that are experiencing the most pain in the workplace, we actually asked them, do you carry this pain home, and does it affect the relationships with your family and friends? And 2/3 of them actually told us yes. So this pain is a serious source of the world's misery.
So whether in business or politics, Jon, leaders use dozens of indicators to measure progress and predict future success or failure. Why is happiness such an important indicator?
The indicator that we need to watch is how we feel. So asking people about their stress and sadness is critical, because most of what dictates our actions is not our rational thought, it's our emotional thought. And the problem is that all the indicators that we watch are indicators that track our rational thought, like how much we make and whether or not we have a job. But what it doesn't track is whether or not we have great friendships, or whether or not we have the right kind of emotional relationship that we should have to work. And that's a problem. That's why so many of these indicators, they haven't been failing society. They just don't tell the entire story about how humanity is doing.
And how can leaders follow well-being and happiness metrics to better understand how people's lives are going?
Well, all they need to do is ask people how their lives are going. And most of the time that national statistics that we track, we're asking people whether or not they have a job. But instead, all leaders need to do is add another component to the metrics that they track, which is asking how people feel. And that's ultimately what Gallup has been doing over the past 15 years, is we ask people whether or not they experience a lot of stress, sadness, physical pain, and worry. And I think one of the most remarkable things about this study is the amount of candor that people have with complete strangers, and how candid they are in terms of expressing how much stress and sadness that they have in their life. And I think that also is really concerning, just how open people are about expressing this kind of pain.
And can you share with us, Jon, some examples of countries where their economies were growing, but the subjective well-being of their citizens was declining?
One of the things that we're tracking everywhere is this concept of contentment. And we ask people whether or not they think their lives on a scale of 0 to 10, and 10 is the best possible life and 0 is the worst possible life, where they stand. And historically, when we look at things like the Arab uprising, we can see that GDP per capita was increasing in places like Egypt and Tunisia. Yet when we ask people about rating their own lives, those particular indicators were crashing. We also saw that in the lead up to Brexit in the 2016 vote. Although GDP per capita was increasing, we also saw that unemployment dropped below 5% for the first time. Yet when we asked people to rate their lives, we saw one of the most significant declines that we'd ever seen, not just in the history of our tracking of the UK, but also in the history of our tracking of our entire global database. So when we talk about how people feel, it's so critical, because how people feel ultimately dictates what they do in life.
And now let's talk about your book, which is entitled The Blind Spot. It discusses the rise of a different kind of inequality, well-being inequality. Can you describe what this is?
Yeah, so the world is very familiar with this concept of inequality, or excuse me, income inequality, which is the haves and have-nots of wealth. And one of the challenges is that it doesn't take into the full appreciation of a great life. So as I mentioned, we've been asking these questions about rate your life on a scale of 0 to 10. And 15 years ago, about 3.5% of the world said, my life is a perfect 10. And about 1.5% said, my life could not be no worse, it's a 0. Fast forward 15 years later, and we see that roughly 8% of the entire world says my life is a perfect 10. And now roughly 8%, that number is quadrupled. The people who say my life is a perfect 0 is also 8%. So you see this massive widening of how people see their lives that's taken place over the past 15 years. And again, it's caused by these very fundamental aspects of life, like physical well-being, like social well-being, and work well-being.
Do you see this widening gap between the haves and the have-nots of a great life narrowing going forward?
I think one of the big challenges is whether or not leaders respond to this, because a lot of leaders are talking about well-being. They're talking about concepts like burnout in the workplace, right. But these issues existed well before the pandemic. So whether or not this is given a reason for leaders to actually take action on this is yet to be seen, because if you take a country like the United States, where there has been an improvement in terms of people's work well-being increasing steadily for a decade, over the past 2 years it's declined. So despite there being a lot of conversations about this, it appears that people's lives at work has gotten substantially worse.
And what do you hope readers will learn from this book, Blind Spot?
I hope that they start appreciating more of the multidimensionality of what makes a great life. We can no longer just look at a thing like pay at work. We also need to look to see whether or not people have the opportunity to do what they do best, whether or not they have opportunities for development, and whether or not they have strong relationships with the people that they work with. And the very last indicator is whether or not they feel cared about by the organization in which they're employed. If leaders were to take these kind of emotional-based indicators far more seriously, I think we would all see a much better world than we have today.
Jon, thank you so much for sharing with us your insights. Gallup CEO Jon Clifton joining us from Singapore.